Greetings and welcome to City Lights Live, the online edition of the City Lights events calendar. I'm Peter Maravellis, the events director at City Lights. On Wednesday, March the 12th, 2025, City Lights had the great pleasure of hosting our dear friend John Freeman for his new anthology, Sacramento Noir, published by Akashic Books. John was joined by Reyna Grande, Maceo Montoya, and Naomi J. Williams as they presented readings and discussion delving into the gritty underbelly of the state of California's capital. Due to some technical difficulties that evening involving bandwidth, the introduction and sporadic moments were punctuated by a loss of both audio and video quality. We re-edited and managed to salvage the main body of the author's readings and a fair amount of their discussion. So even in its truncated form, it's a fabulous program. We hope you enjoy it as much as we enjoyed it in person.
One of the fun things about commissioning for a book like this is it's not so much about asking crime writers and noir writers to go and do what they've already done. It's asking literary writers to enter a new genre and to adopt some of its conventions and subvert some of those conventions to tell stories about the city where they're from and to tell enlarging stories that are bigger than the stories that have been told before. And I think there's a lot of social capital that's been fracked out of Sacramento in sort of large forms of culture. But there's a lot more to Sacramento than you've seen. And Lady Bird and other, Party of Five, I think, had a Sacramento plot. It's an evolving city. It's a very diverse city. It's a city that has completely buried some of its neighborhoods. It's a city with a lot of crime. It's a city, because it's the capital, with a lot of corruption. And so it's a city that's ripe for telling some noir stories. And the writers that we're going to hear from tonight have taken that city as the starting point. And its environs, Davis, Woodland, all the areas around that they call home, to sort of refresh the genre and refresh our sense of what the city is. So what we're going to do tonight is each one of them is going to read briefly. And because there's one podium, we're going to do it this way, where I'm going to ask them a question, they're going to come up and answer it and then read. And I might ask them another question, and then the next person will come up. And so Maceo Montoya will read first, followed by Reyna Grande, and ending with Naomi J. Williams, who's the last in the alphabet, but not the least. So Maceo, it's an honor to have you here. Thank you for coming all the way down from Woodland or Davis. We didn't mention he was born in Elmira, Mistress of the Dark. Somehow that comes off the tongue faster than Elmira. And I guess I want to ask you, why do you think Sacramento suits noir as you come up before you read from your stories? And maybe say just a little bit about why you decided to set your story in the middle of a Chicana art movement, in the middle of a mural that was being painted.
Yeah. Thank you, John. As an artist, as a writer, I'm fascinated by places that are overlooked. And you mentioned, Sacramento, not being, a setting for many movies, certainly not many, noir films. But I would say the same for literature. But yet those stories are there, and need to be told. And I feel like wherever there's, kind of forgotten or overlooked places, there's this kind of opportunity to discover stories in all their different forms, and so I think like any city, as you mentioned, the crime or the corruption and the capital of our state, and kind of the convergence of different powers. There's lots of stories there, but For me, that wasn't my connection. I grew up in Elmira. I live in Woodland, and so any time that we would go to Sacramento, it would be to visit my uncle and my family that lived there. And my uncle Jose Montoya was a co-founder of, it was at first called the Rebel Chicano Art Front. It had the same acronym as the Royal Canadian Air Force. And so people would say, what do you have to do with the Royal Canadian Air Force? And so they were performers and just jokesters. And so they started calling themselves the Royal Chicano Air Force. And this is in the early 1970s. And they had a lot of fun with it. And they would wear like World War II bomber jackets and call their VW buses planes. And when you kind of rose up the ranks of the arts organization, they would give you wings, and they were a lot of fun to be around. And so I just remember going to art exhibits and poetry readings, and so that was my connection to Sacramento. And so until there's a Woodland Noir, I was in Santa Cruz Noir, which I can count on one hand how many times I've been there. So at least I had a little bit more connection to Sacramento. But a number of years ago, I wrote a book, Chicano Movement for Beginners. And I was doing all of this research on the organizations that, formed the Chicano movement. And there was an attempt by the FBI to infiltrate these organizations, and I remember my uncle talking about that, and I kind of just chalked it up to conspiracy theory. But he would talk about COINTELPRO and how they had to be aware, and it really was the case that these small, just kind of ragtag organizations, no matter how small, there was an attempt to divide them. But really, my takeaway from the writing that book was that most of the organizations were they disintegrated because of internal dynamics. It had nothing to do with the outside. It had nothing to do with anything structural. I mean, I guess it all kind of played a role in it, but it was about personalities. It was about egos, and I know that was a facet of the Royal Chicano Air Force as well. Kind of falling in love with the same woman, competing egos, and especially as an organization, full of artists. And so that was really my entry into this story. Was thinking through what would it be like for a character who wants to be part of this organization but is considered suspect and always kept at a distance. The goal of COINTELPRO wasn't just to monitor radical organizations. The FBI wanted to destroy them from the inside. Every organization had its differences, elements that believed in the slow arc of justice, and others who wanted more radical change. Slow change was too stable. Radical change demanded actions, and those actions could be steered in nefarious directions. How many groups in those years blew themselves up in botched bomb-making workshops? But perhaps more dangerous than homemade explosives were oversized egos. Leadership squabbles led to splintering, and small groups are easier to monitor and control. If you're fighting each other all the time, then you lose the ability to fight the state. I mentioned this because of Enna was in COINTELPRO, and Enna Enamorada was a figure who showed up and quickly became part of the organization, and he's suspicious of her. Then she was certainly following the manual. Antonio and Eliseo had been inseparable since their first year at Sac State, when they enrolled in the professor's barrio art classes. They joked that the left-handed Antonio and right-handed Eliseo were an ambidextrous mural painting machine. It didn't take long for Enna to jam its gears. I witnessed it happen. At first, they took turns instructing her how to paint, but they wasted too much time talking, leaning against the scaffolding railings, gesticulating with their hands, waxing philosophical. They almost stopped painting altogether. They grew jealous of one another and made fools of themselves as they vied to be Enna's mentor. They forgot about Bobby and Ernesto, who, though good painters, needed direction. They rarely called on me to wash brushes. Within weeks, progress on the Southside Park murals had slowed to a crawl. I almost wished the handsome charmer Bobby had gotten to her first. He would have seduced her, then lost interest, on to the next girl. But Antonio and Eliseo were such dedicated artists and activists that they weren't accustomed to these feelings. They kept telling themselves they were just teaching Enna how to be a revolutionary artist. And as long as they kept talking about muralism, they could pretend that the ardor in their hearts was political, not carnal. She gave them equal attention, careful not to tip the scales in favor of either one. My friend Letty said she was playing them like bongo drums, bouncing back and forth, a willing student, absorbing their lessons, adopting their language. She was even becoming a good painter. I spent more time washing her brushes than those of the muralists. I was trying to impress. She barely acknowledged me. She just called me hey, as in, hey, can you clean these brushes? Can you refill my palette? She hadn't changed. She still acted like the Jenny I knew back in the 4th grade. Haughty, better then. One afternoon, she announced to the muralist that she had to leave for class. Antonio and Eliseo immediately deflated. She walked toward the paint table to grab her leather satchel and poncho, which she had left underneath for safekeeping. You taking art classes at State? I asked. She'd even look my way as she gathered her things. Yeah, intermediate drawing, 2B, beginning painting, 1A, color theory. Her voice trailed off. What a strange answer. I didn't ask for her course schedule. I thought on my toes. Isn't Redfield an awesome instructor? Oh yeah, he's great, she said as she walked off. There was no one named Redfield in the art department. I had made him up. It's true, I was a nobody who didn't deserve her time. She could have just been blowing me off, but maybe, just maybe, I had caught her in a lie. I watched her cross T Street, a group of viejitos ogling her as she passed. She got into a maroon Datsun, parked in front of the church. I noted her license plate and decided to start following her.
I just want to ask you one or two more questions, Maceo. You mentioned two things that maybe, unless people in the audience are all from Sacramento, which is Southside Park and Sac State Art Schools, art program. And I wonder if you could tell people a little bit about the Sac State art program and why it's significant and why it might be a kind of noir-friendly kind of environment.
Oh, interesting. I mean, I guess the RCIF founded, so both my uncle and the co-founder Esteban Villa, they were professors at Sacramento State. And so a lot of the members of the RCAF were their students, and they formed the Barrio Art Program. They started classes there in Midtown. They opened art centers. And so I think leaving the university and entering into these neighborhoods, and it was really like, we're not going to be in the ivory tower. We're not going to, separate ourselves from the community that we want to work with. And so you had, artists like my uncle and Esteban Villa, who had a certain stature, had already established themselves in their careers. You had students, but then you had guys from the neighborhood, and it included winos and ex-pintos, guys who had got out of prison. And so I think whenever you have that combination of just different walks of life, there's possibilities in that. There was creative possibility, but then in the case of, a noir story, there's, I guess, just tension that can be created. Yeah.
The story, if you read it, it works a little bit like watching people make a mural, which, given your background, you're also a visual artist, is really fascinating. And I wonder if you could talk just a little bit about that before we pass it to Reyna, about what it's like to sort of make a mural in front of the reader, and what that sort of makes possible in terms of in storytelling.
It's a great question. I have no idea. I see a couple of my students from UC Davis that are here, and it was pointed out to me just a couple of weeks ago that when I'm talking in class about their stories, that I'm kind of visualizing them, and that's certainly how I read, and that's how I kind of seeing the structure. It's very visual, and so it makes sense that it would make its way into my work. I think with a mural, with anything, I'm always seeing just the process and the layers involved. The thing with muralism is that it takes weeks, and it can take months, it can take years, but it's a large surface, and so it's a lot of the labor is like putting up the scaffolding, setting up the tables. People are passing you on the street and talking to you, wanting to know about the imagery. There's the drawing, there's the gridding the wall, there's the drawing, there's the underpainting, and then the layering of paint on top of it. And so I think just kind of understanding that process has always helped me when it comes to, I guess, many facets of my life, but certainly writing fiction. Yeah.
Well, to go from one sort of externalized story in that sense, I think one of Reyna Grande's great skills is getting very, very quickly inside the head of her characters, and you've seen this in all three of her novels, but also in her National Book Critics Circle Award finalist memoir, The Country Between Us, where she goes in and out of her head as a child, and then sort of you watch her grow up into a teenager and near adult. And one of the things that short stories are very allergic to is too much in internalness, because the story has to be short and has to move. And what you've been able to do, Reyna, in this story about two brothers, a priest and an artist, who are working together on a new artwork for a church, which is going to be a portrait of Mary Magdalene, which is going to be based on your third character in this story, who in her real life in the story is a sex worker. And in that trio, you managed to go into all three of their heads, and yet the story still moves and has momentum. So could you come up and maybe read from the story and talk a little bit about why, for you, Sacramento might be a good setting for noir?
Okay. Hello, everybody. So good to be here. Thank you so much, John, for those questions. Yeah, well, Sacramento, I think it's a really interesting place, but I'm going to talk a little bit about the weather, because I think Sacramento has a very interesting weather. Like in the winters, if we have a wet winter, like it's always raining and it gets dark very early. By 5 o'clock, it's already dark, so the days are short and the nights are long, which kind of lends itself for some noirish feelings there. Also the wind, like sometimes we have some crazy winds that come in, and it makes all kinds of weird sounds in my house, like whistling and just stuff. But also the heat. I mean, when it's 112, who doesn't want to kill somebody, right? Like, come on, like it drives me nuts. And so I definitely see Sacramento as a noir kind of city. For my story, so there's a few things that inspired this story. One was a trip to the Santa Barbara mission that I went on a behind the scenes tour with a nun and with a friend of mine, Melinda Palacio, who's a poet. And we were hanging out, exploring the mission, and we came upon this statue of Mary Magdalene and Jesus. And I was told the story, the behind-the-scenes story, that the man and the woman who modeled for these statues fell in love during the creation of the statues. And I just started, I just started thinking, oh, that would make such an interesting story. Like, who was this woman? Who was this man? How did they come together? How did the artists choose them, right? And at the same time, I had also made some new friends. And they were this couple that had met while the husband was a priest, and he left the priesthood and married this woman. And so those two combinations of that seeing those statues and then meeting these new friends, and I was so fascinated that he used to be a priest, and I would ask him all these questions about how hard was it to make that decision, and then they would tell me their love story. So I decided to kind of bring them together into this story here. And so the story I ended up writing is about a has-been artist who has all of a sudden gets this commission to make a statue of Mary Magdalene and Jesus, and his brother is a priest at this church where the statues are gonna go. And he meets this sex worker that he hires to be his model for Mary Magdalene. And the brothers have a history of obsessing over the same woman. And so this kind of starts being, the same pattern is being recreated now with this sex worker. And so the scene that I'm going to read to you is from the point of view of the sex worker. Her name is Margarita, and she's an immigrant from El Salvador who has been forced into prostitution. And by now, she has been hired to pose for the artist, and she's on her way to his house for one of the sessions. Margarita had known men like him, men who took what they wanted from you. She didn't know much about this gringo whose house she was not walking to. What she knew was that she would allow herself to be used, not unlike previous times, to finally be set free. As she made her way up Folsom Boulevard, she wasn't surprised she'd never been to this part of the city. Beautiful tree-lined streets, luxurious houses surrounded by the greenest plants, pruned and tucked into their proper places. She felt as if she had entered another world. Her clients were not of his class. She had gotten to know cheap motels that smell of cigarette smoke and sweat, and she actually preferred that to taking them to her apartment, the place where she had saved a little piece of her soul. She wondered what exactly he wanted from her. What a strange thing it was that he wanted her to pose for him, to be Mary Magdalene. There was once a time when she'd been a pious churchgoer, when among the scent of flowers and candles, she had prayed many a Hail Mary and Our Father. But that had stopped when the saints no longer listened, when she realized that they were nothing but stone or clay, and they would not, could not help her. She made her way down the driveway. The house, although magnificent in size, looked like a hack compared to the beautiful homes around it. Here the plants grew wild. Trees in need of pruning hovered menacingly over the arbor. She felt a pang of pity for the house, for its evident neglect, for belonging to a man who did not love it enough to care. He opened the door before she even knocked. "Magdalene," he said, then pulled her inside and guided her to the living room. A few things had changed since she was last there. He put the dining table in the center of the living room and covered it with a sheet. Floor lamps were placed around the table, and the lights shone on the center, on the spot she knew was meant for her. She stood awkwardly beside him, staring at the table, at the blinding lights. Had she made a mistake? She thought about what had brought her here and forced herself to stand taller, to look him in the eye and not be afraid. She had to do this right. She couldn't mess this up. "The bathroom's over there," he said, pointing to a door to the side of the living room. "Everything needs to come off. I left the robe in there for you." She had known, a part of her had known, that it would be like this, but she hoped that she would be allowed to keep something on. "Magdalene," he said, putting a hand on her shoulder, "I will not hurt you. You can trust me." She could trust no one, but she wanted to believe that no harm would come to her from him. She thought about her captors, the men her father had hired to bring them to this country, and who had then forced her into this life, this hell. Maybe, just maybe, she could finish paying them her debt, and she could finally be free. The robe he left for her in the bathroom was of the softest material she'd ever touched. She loved the way it caressed her bare skin, the way it enveloped her in warmth, as if she wrapped herself in a summer cloud. She walked to the living room, clutching the belt of the robe. She wanted to keep it on and never take it off. He extended his hand and helped her up onto the table. He was so tall that as she sat there, he still towered above her. "May I?" he said, grabbing hold of her shoulders. She let go of her grip on the belt and undid the knot. She closed her eyes. He put the heater on high so that she wouldn't be cold, but still, she shivered when the rope came off. He said, "Try to relax. It will be difficult sometimes to sit still for long periods, but you will get used to it." He stood a few feet away from her, his hands holding a sketchbook and pencil. He told her about Mary Magdalene, about the crucifixion. She knew the story. She had grown up knowing about Jesus, about how he had sacrificed himself for sinners like her. The man said, "Mary Magdalene was there with him until the very end. Close your eyes. Imagine you are her. You are looking up at Jesus on the cross. Show me how it feels, knowing that you're about to lose him." She raised her eyes to the ceiling, but hard as she tried, she could not picture herself as anything but who she was. And Jesus? She had given up on him long ago. She could not mourn his death now. She had mourned it enough, had brought him enough flowers, lit enough candles, and kneeled for too many hours at his feet. And all for what? Not like that! He tore the sheet from the sketchbook. She had not even noticed when he began to draw her. He ran his fingers through his grayish hair. "Okay, forget Jesus. Think of someone you have lost, someone you loved, a brother, a husband, a father." Her body jolted and she glared at him. What did he know about who she loved, who she'd lost, and what right did he have asking her to bare her soul to him? He must have noticed her anger because he quickly added, "Okay, forget that. Just make it up, okay? Just pretend. Imagine anything you want, but give me what I want. Put your hand out like this, as if you're reaching for him, as if you can bear to let him go." He returned to his sketchbook. As his pencil began to move again, she watched the rain slapping the window panes, and the face of her father appeared in her mind's eye. She thought about that morning when they come to seek refuge in this country. They didn't get far. Not long after they passed the southern border of Mexico, they found themselves clinging with all their might to the roof of the train, made slippery by the rain. Then suddenly, a branch hit her father square in the face, and he slipped. He left her to make the journey alone, to fall prey to bad men, to pay with her own body for a chance to make a life in this unforgiving country. "Beautiful," a voice said. Margarita opened her eyes. For a moment she'd forgotten where she was, who she was with. She reached to touch her cheek, to dry the tears that were rolling down, but he stopped her. "Leave them," he said, his hand flying furiously over his sketchbook. One after another, sheets were torn off. She wondered if his hand hurt, and if it did, would the pain even reach him where he was right now? Somewhere between reality and insanity. Thank you.
That is one of the most amazing cuts between her right in the middle of this reverie of a terrible, terrible experience. And he goes, "Beautiful." And it reminds me that one of the core sort of tropes of noir is the dangerous dame. And within that trope, what is actually happening is there's often a cross-class romance, a forbidden romance. And sometimes it's like the detective who is like an everyman and a high-class dame. But often it's the other way, and it's a woman who isn't wealthy, disguised as a wealthy woman, connected to a powerful, wealthy man. And your story has disguises within disguises. And I'm sort of curious, you've written about sort of unlikely or cross-border romances in the Ballad of Love and Glory. But what did you find writing this particular one was fun or interesting or made it difficult when you were sort of trying to think about how it fit within noir?
Yeah. Well, definitely the obsession, that Jacob becomes obsessed with her. And part of that is that he's so desperate to get back what he once had, the fame, his art, the social standing that he had, the admiration that he used to have as an artist. And so now he's kind of desperate and he is using her to be able to make a comeback and to get his heart back. And so there's this a little bit of that obsession, but like Maceo mentioned, competing egos, because then his brother, the priest, that those are two egos that are constantly competing, and you can see that from the beginning when I introduce both of these characters, that they have this history as brothers. There's this sibling rivalry that's been taking place, and then there's the mention of a crime that Jacob committed previously that Daniel was complicit to, because he kept his secret, and he knows that Jacob killed the woman before, and this is a secret between them. And now when Margarita comes into the scene, it starts playing out again. You know, that competition with the two of them, with their egos getting in the way, becoming obsessed with the same woman, and you can kind of see this feel this tension, this darkness, this obsession, and borderline insanity with both of them playing.
It's not mentioned in the scene that you read at this point, but they're in the house that they grew up in, that Jacob and his brother grew up in, which seems significant. She has to walk out of her neighborhood, cross Sacramento, and go into this other neighborhood where she is going to be on display, and that seems significant to me.
Yeah, and then there's that right after that, as she's coming into this neighborhood that she's never been to, and comes into this house, and here's Jacob trying to capture her on paper, and then Daniel shows up, and she stands there naked in front of both of them, and so it's like this really complicated scene, and I had to write it from her point of view, because I really wanted to capture how she felt being kind of stuck in this situation with these two brothers, and also the hope that she had that this could lead to her freedom. But as we see later, it kind of pulls her into even a more difficult path than the one she's already on. Yeah.
I was rewatching a bunch of noir films as we were putting this together, and I really could count on one hand the numbers of times the film camera suggested to me that this was the point of view of the woman. And I'm curious what it's like, whether you thought that, and what you were determined not to do, or what to add by having her perspective in there, in addition to having this particular scene from her point of view.
Yeah. Well, I didn't want her to just be an object, the object of obsession. Like, I really wanted to give her a voice. I wanted to give her a chance to, like, tell the story from her point of view. And I also worried about, like, you know, perpetuating stereotypes, or like painting Latinos as criminals and prostitutes and pimps. And so with her, like, I wanted to capture her vulnerability, and how she was in many ways being victimized, but at the same time to give her some agency and try to give her some control, even though she's in a situation where she has very little control. But even just like still having boundaries of, like, you know, where she works, and how she handles Jacob, and she deals with Daniel. Like, she's still exerting some kind of agency there, and that's what I try to give her.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, I thought you did it beautifully, and it's such a pleasure to have you here. Thank you, Reyna.
Thank you.
Grande.
Thank you.
I just realized I should probably stand up since there's people watching from there. The last reader is going to come up now, who's also not just a reader, but part of the curator of these events. She's one of the forces behind this issue because she's so connected to Sacramento literary circles. And also something that Reyna said is very key to, I think, what Naomi Williams has been doing with all of her work, from her extraordinary novel story cycle, Landfalls, which follows a noted 18th century explorer going around the world, landing time and time again, and each time it just gets worse. And one of the things that is noir's most voluptuous comfort is the preconceived idea that I think frames all of it, which is that everything's bad and it's going to get worse. There are no happy endings. It's like it's not, and it doesn't have the kind of tinny sound of tragedy. It has the atmospheric feeling of decay and just apocalypse, for lack of a better word. And one of the things that I find that the stories are doing in this anthology is saying, okay, yes, things are going to get bad. They're already bad. But in this brief time period, my character has some agency. They have an ability to push back against the situation that they find themselves in. And this is precisely what happens in Naomi Williams's story, which is set in a neighborhood in Sacramento, which doesn't exist anymore. It's now a Macy's. Before it was a Macy's, it was part of a freeway. But Sacramento used to have the 4th largest Japanese American population in America. And that's no longer the case, although there are a lot of Japanese and Japanese American people in Sacramento. And Naomi's story takes place before that has been utterly determined. And in fact, it takes place right as it seems it's going to go a different way. And it's a triumph. And it's so nice to have you back in print in this anthology. And your help in putting together the anthology, Naomi, was just beyond anything I could have ever expected. It made it possible. So Naomi Williams, come up and read your story.
Well, thank you, John, and thank you to so many friends, new and old out there. I'm really glad that you're all here, and thank you to City Lights for hosting all of us tonight. My story takes place mostly on Wednesday, November 3, 1954, which was the day after Election Day. And the people in Japantown were celebrating that day because a redevelopment bond issue that had been on the ballot the day before and would have razed their neighborhood, R-A-Z-E-D, destroyed their neighborhood, failed. So they thought their neighborhood, which had survived wartime incarceration and had come back after that, had been saved. They turned out to be wrong, but my narrator, George, runs a florist shop on 4th Street in Sacramento with his mother, Kimiko. And also working there is Michiko, a young woman who was once engaged to George's older brother who was killed in action during the war. And the only other thing you need to know is that the word hakujin means quite literally white person. All day long, the shopkeeper's bell on our door tinkled as customers came and went, bowing and exchanging congratulations. よかったですね。そうですね。本当に安心ですね。Thank goodness. Yes, what a relief, etc., etc. I wanted to shout, you people should know better. They're going to find a way to screw us. Instead, I sullenly rang up their purchases, autumnal bouquets of yellow and orange mums, red and bronze button palms, sunflowers, blood red roses. Ironically, the only person with whom I could dispense with the compulsory pleasantries was a slick-haired hakujin who came in during a lull just before the noon rush. He claimed to be some kind of antiques or art dealer and had been sniffing around the neighborhood for months, looking for people anxious to unload their kimono and scrolls and ceramics before eminent domain forced us to consolidate our belongings and start over again. The first time he'd come by, I'd laughed at him. You're more than a decade late, man, I told him. Should have come through in 42. We were practically giving away our family treasures to you lot. I'm just trying to help, he said. Change is coming, and change is expensive. He winked at my mother. See you around, Kimmy. My mother hated the overfamiliarity of Americans. She especially hated it when people Americanized her name, Kimiko. And now the man was back, sporting a suit but no tie, chest hair poking out the top of his wide-collared shirt. Hey, Kimmy, how goes it? He called. My mother was winding some wire around a cluster of heavy-headed Gerbera daisies, her hands deft and strong. She nodded wordlessly in his direction. Sometimes playing inscrutable Oriental was the only power she had. Haven't you heard the news? I said. Oh, I've heard. He languidly took a stainless steel cigarette case from his pocket. We only have flowers for sale, I said. The man fixed his frosty eyes on me. Yesterday was a hiccup, he said. I know it. You know it. He gestured around the shop with his unlit cigarette. All this? Poof. You're wasting your time. He shrugged. Maybe I just want some flowers for my girl. Where's that pretty Michiko? A current of rage shot through me, and he could see it. He lit the cigarette and tossed the match on the floor. $9 for a dozen roses, I said. Sign says $7. Special $9 deal, just for you. He laughed, then nodded to my mother. Sayonara, Kimmy. He didn't bother closing the door behind him. Aho, I growled after him. Idiot. Then I kicked the door shut. A daisy stem snapped in my mother's hands. Why you act like that? She cried. What if customer sees? No one else is here, Kasan. I am here, she said. She dropped the ruined bouquet on the counter. Go check on flower wire, she said. We running out. I was being sent to the cellar like a bad child. If I had been a child, it would certainly have felt like punishment. Our cellar resembled nothing so much as a secret underground bootlegger's hideout. Its one naked, dangling bulb threw shadows all around, turning everything eerie. The wall of neatly arranged knives and shears and my late father's old handsaw, the tall urns filled with dried grasses and branches, the shelves stacked high with harmless florist supplies. And then I'm going to skip a few pages where George goes upstairs and does a bunch of administrative work while his mother goes and visits to celebrate with some of her friends, and the lovely Michiko comes to manage the store. But then he realizes it's grown dark and the building is very strangely quiet. So he goes downstairs and finds the shop deserted. For the second time that day, I kicked the shop door closed. Thankfully, the window and the door didn't break. We just paid $35 for the lettering on the glass. Sakura City, florist, with our phone number and ours. Annoyance mounting over my mother and Michiko's absence, I rushed through our closing routine, wiping down the counters, depositing the cash in the lockbox in my mother's bedroom, turning out the lights. At the alley side door, I remembered I still hadn't checked on the floral wire. Damn it, I muttered. That order should have gone in that afternoon. I spun around and made my way down the splintery stairs in the dark. At the bottom, my foot bumped against something bigger, denser. A bag of soil? A raccoon? A jolt of unease flashed through me as I reached up and pulled the chain to the light bulb. In the swaying light, I found, crumpled on the dirt floor in front of our tidy storage shelves, surrounded by the shards of a heavy chartreuse vase, a dead Hakujin. His face wore the expression of a man stunned by how things had turned out. It was the antiques dealer, and someone had garroted him with floral wire. Thank you.
I have to say, I think Naomi wins the award for best verb used. This is the only garroting that has happened in the book, unfortunately. One of the things we've had a few events together, and we've noticed, at least in conversations, is that in noir, at least in this anthology, there's often a kind of nested set of crimes. And I would say within your story, Sakura City, the sort of the biggest, oldest crime is the incarceration of the Japanese, and then there's the crime of the recent bond issue to try to displace an already displaced people again. And then within that is this murder that you just described. And thinking about that, I used to teach this class at NYU on writers using English for the first time. And one of the books we read for that class was Enemies, a Love Story, which was serialized in the Jewish Forward. And it was the first comedy about the Holocaust. And Singer got a lot of grief for this because it was like, this is not a laughing matter. And yet I dare you to read that novel and not laugh about a guy who escapes the Holocaust by hiding out with a Polish Gentile woman, coming to New York, marrying her out of gratitude, getting a Romanian mistress who was also a Holocaust survivor, and then discovering that his wife, who he thought was dead, was also alive, and having a wife, a mistress, and a girlfriend who he travels amongst for the rest of the book. And it made me realize that there is in some ways this idea that you can only write certain genres a certain distance from a crime. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about that with regards to the incarceration, with regards to this period that you're writing about, because I feel like there's something really refreshing about you using some of these tropes with this particular material, because it feels like, yes, finally we can kind of get at certain aspects that maybe were less available to us, at least as readers, when the the idea was witness or sort of literary evocation.
Yeah, I think that most Californians of any education whatsoever know about the incarceration of Japanese Americans during the war, right? A history that I feel like is very present with us right now, with all the things that are going on. Much less well known is what happened with redevelopment to many neighborhoods in the United States, actually, but including Japantown. Many, even old-timey Sacramentans, have no idea that we had the fourth largest Japantown in the United States for very many years, or that it had not simply, wandered away. It's not like people had sort of just over the years gone away. No, the neighborhood was systematically dismantled. And it wasn't just the Japanese Americans who were displaced. Many other immigrants were displaced from that neighborhood, and also a lot of Black people who had moved into the neighborhood during incarceration, many of whom had stayed there afterwards. So it was a very diverse neighborhood. They were all pushed out too. And I think I told you this in one conversation we had. Many of the Japanese Americans who were displaced by what actually did happen to that neighborhood, right? That the people who were celebrating that day, the day after Election Day, were wrong. And my narrator, George, was right. They did find a way to screw them over, right? They did a whole total end run around that bond measure and just found a different way to finance the destruction of that neighborhood. And 17 city blocks were just leveled. If you know Sacramento at all and you go over the Tower Bridge and you approach the Capitol, that thing that's called Capitol Mall, and is basically just ugly dead grass most of the time, except when they have festivals there, used to be a neighborhood. There were hundreds of craftsman-style houses, thousands of people lived there, all displaced. I lost track of what I was talking about.
Yeah, and I'm so glad that you brought all this in, because is it possible that certain kind of genres, certain treatments of this material have to slightly wait a little bit, and maybe are more effective after time as ways to resurrect information or to take what is known and then to sort of slightly tilt it?
Maybe. I know that there, even though this story is not that well known in Sacramento, there have been historians and other people, museum people who've come and done a bunch of research about this. So there was a lot available to me as a historical fiction writer in terms of archival footage, even video of bulldozers coming and knocking over buildings and stuff like that, and people in the neighborhood being interviewed and talking about how sad they are that they're going to be displaced again. And that's all been gathered because of time, right? And because people have said, hey, this is an important story to tell. So there have been exhibits at museums about this. There have been some books written about this. So there is that. This is not my personal history, I didn't grow up in Sacramento. I was born in Japan. I'm more of an immigrant who came here at a very early age with my mother, who's sitting right there, than I am like a person with a deep Japanese American background. But when you first called me about this, I immediately thought of this neighborhood, because one of the things that happens in noir is people are up against forces that they are seemingly powerless to do anything about, right? And there's this idea of like being up against institutions or up against the man or forces, right? Whether they're natural or human, racism, et cetera. And like try as they might, it's like swimming upstream. And I wanted to tell a story like that, felt like a very noir story where, and also, a lot of the people in this neighborhood, despite having suffered internment during the war, a clearly terrible and unconstitutional thing that happened to them, a lot of them thought that this time nothing like that could possibly happen again. And they trusted the results of the election. They trusted that when they went down to city council with, all the respectable members of their society to say, hi, we're not a slum, like this is a good neighborhood, please save it, that they thought that was going to work. They actually had some faith in that. And, they were quickly disabused of that notion. And when this is what I was going to say before, you and I talked about how after this neighborhood was destroyed, many of the people there actually moved south, towards Southside Park, actually, which is featured in your story, Maceo, because there weren't racial covenants down there. And then the highway came in and they were displaced, many of them for the third time. So yeah, just like big crimes and big crimes and big crimes and yeah.
There's a story in here by Jose Vade, which is set around almost exactly the same time as yours, and it's about, there's a couple characters in it, but one of the main characters is a kind of card dealer who's double dealing with he's got a rounder working with him, and he's working at one of the other jazz clubs in the city where one of your characters works as a second job.
Right.
And you mentioned briefly as you talked about the story that it was not just a Japanese neighborhood, it was a sort of Japanese and black neighborhood. And I wonder what came about as you were realizing that this story would have to touch a sort of another population of people who called Sacramento home.
Yeah, if I'd been writing a novel, there would have been much more about that, right? Because when all the Japanese were booted out of their homes in Sacramento, people moved into those spaces, and the Zanzibar Club, which is a setting in Jose's story, and the Momo Club, which is a setting in my story, were Japanese-owned clubs, and then they were sold to black owners who came in when the Japanese owners were interned. And then they remained black clubs when many of the Japanese people came back. So it was a very mixed neighborhood. In my story, George, the narrator, works as a dishwasher at the Momo Club. His mother and his friends don't like it that he works there because it's not a Japanese club anymore. So, it's like, why do you work for those people, right? So I tried to hint at some of that tension in the neighborhood that was probably relatively new at that time. But Japanese American civic leaders and black civil rights people came together to try to save the neighborhood. They realized that they were all imperiled. And, some of the more prominent black civil rights lawyers in Sacramento history came out of the movement to try to save the West End. And of course they all lost, but then there were people that came up through that and had a significant influence on later city life. But yeah, I found a lot of the ads and things for those clubs. I mean, they got big people, Duke Ellington. I mean, it was awesome. It was a great jazz city. Can I say?
There's so many great sort of threads going now, and I feel like some of the audience might have some questions for Maceo or Naomi or Reyna. Would anybody like to ask a question?
I'm gonna sit down.
No, go ahead. I thought it was you go.
This is a question for Reyna, and if all the writers want to give their impressions too, but specifically because you mentioned that your story is like composite with two separate characters, some some you're kind of basing on historical research. I'm wondering, like, how do you decide what features of the people to put together in the story? Like, what kind of characteristics? Is it just something in a moment where you're like, oh, this is going to be something plausible? Or, yeah, if you could speak to that.
Yeah, you can use that one. Yeah. Thank you.
All right. Hello. Yeah, that's a great question. I really don't know when I start a story what my characters are going to be like. Like, I have a vague idea, but it's once I write it, like, I start to spend more time with them, learn who they are, what are their flaws. I try to work a lot on that. Like, what are their flaws and their weaknesses? What's their wound? That's something that with all my characters, I'm really fascinated by the wound, because a lot of their actions, the things they do, the way they feel, and the way they interact with other people stems from that wound. So for me, that's like the biggest component of a character. It's always that. And finding the wound in Jacob, the loss of his art and wanting it back. And then in Daniel, the wound of having lost the woman that he loved because of his brother's obsessions. And then in Margarita, and finding her wound. And so that was for me the strongest part about these characters. Yeah.
I have another writing process kind of question that some of you actually started to touch on a little bit, I think. I'm wondering, when you, as a writer, when you're given, when you are offered this, asked to write a piece on commission with a specific genre, like noir in this case, what kinds of preliminary thinking or research, kind of writ large, watching movies, or what kind of things do you do with your time and in your mind to think about the framework that the genre is handing to you?
I think that's a great question, and I've been so impressed with some of the writers who have actually done research. Naomi, Jose Vadi, like when they were describing their stories, and I wrote a Maceo story. I didn't think about noir at all, but I think I'm always drawn to characters who are outsiders, and I'm Jewish on my mother's side, and my Jewish grandmother, she's 95. She's always felt like there's been this war for her grandson, and like between the Chicanos and the Jews have lost out. And what's interesting is like I've always kind of like thought about the two cultures, and that they're like just the consummate outsiders, right? Chicanos, no matter how hard they try, they're always kind of caught in between. They don't fit neither here nor there, and that's a part of their identity. And then I think when it comes to, some of the Jewish literature that I'm drawn to, like early Philip Roth, but even like someone like Italo Zevel and Zeno's Conscience, what I'm drawn to in those works is that they're just kind of in their neurosis, and they're just kind of going over and over in their mind. It's just like they don't fit. And I feel like that fit into the noir genre because if you're an outsider and you're just trying to kind of get a sense of things, but you also have this very unique entry and perspective that sheds light that the insider doesn't get.
Hi, this is Naomi. I had never written noir before, but I actually work really well under pressure. So actually, I love it when people say, "Hey, can you write an X?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I think I can. When is the deadline?" And then well, actually, I didn't meet your deadline, but then it gets the gears in my brain going. But I have written a lot of historical fiction, so that is sort of where I went to. First, but I'm so nerdy. I went and looked up noir online. Like, what are the elements of noir? I remember Googling that. What elements make a story noir? And I went and watched a bunch of movies I hadn't seen before. And one of the things I came away with, I saw it in Niagara. I don't know if any of you've seen this movie with Marilyn Monroe, right? Okay, there's some really awesome noir movies, but a lot of them just don't make any sense. At the end, you say, what happened? And it's like one of the elements of it is we are all in a world that just makes no sense. And so I think my story does make sense, but it takes place in a world that has stopped making sense for a lot of people, right? So, yeah, I don't know if that's a helpful answer.
Anyone else? No? John, do you have any final thoughts?
2 microphones to make them with. No, that's just, as you can tell, we could have a seemingly endless conversation about this, because once you start peeling back the layers of history that Naomi and Maceo and Reyna have in their stories, the psychogeography of the places that they're writing about, the sort of inner workings of the character and the characters that they have made, you have that kind of vortex, which is also, I think, one of the key elements of noir, is this sort of not an escalation, but a sort of vortexing in, and in which it ultimately kind of implodes at the end of the novel or film into that sort of nonsensical ending that Naomi just mentioned. One thing that I should say as an editor is one of the most perilous acts of commissioning is to ask a fiction writer to write a story on deadline in a genre. I mean, I found when I worked at Granta magazine, where I was an editor before, like commissioning fiction was just really such a bad idea. Because essentially, you with an essay on deadline, you can you can really beat an essay into shape. You can just sort of hammer it into shape. But a story will, once you start jumping up and down on it, will resist you, sort of like an angry dog. It's like, no, I'm not ready. And so one of the things that the three of them did, just really to a degree that I've never actually seen, is respond to a commission on deadline in a genre. And it's so hard, and you guys have all done it very well. In addition to the copies of Sacramento Noir, we have one of Reyna's novels, her memoir. We have at least 2 books by Maceo, and we have Naomi's book Landfalls. So if you have Sacramento Noir, pick up one of these. You will not be sad you did. And it's just so cool to share a stage with you as a 2-time veteran of this anthology junket, and to be here at City Lights, which is where I think I've bought more noir than any other place in the country.
Well, John, I love how you've evolved the series, because, over the years, we've just kind of seen people, absorbing noir in its different forms. And I certainly have seen the quality of the writing and also the concerns and also reflecting what's happening politically in this country. And I think especially with this particular anthology, there's a lot of nuance going on here in a lot of these stories. And yeah, I imagine you must have just been pulling your hair out trying to get it all together before deadline, but you did a fine job. And
I missed 3 of my
thanks
deadlines.
to the 3 of you for, joining us tonight. And so thanks again. And thanks to all of you for joining us.